Good evening. I'm Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Okora at Pugh Hall for our event. It's great to have you here, whether you're here in person or attending remotely. This is the biggest audience we've had in person since we started doing live events again this fall, so it's great to have you here. Before I introduce the moderator and the panelists for tonight's event, I have some housekeeping duties. So for the first half of tonight's event, the panelists will respond to questions from our moderator. The second half will be devoted to audience Q&A. If you're here in Pugh Hall, we'll have 2 mics that will be circulating, so we'll just ask you to put your hand up and we'll bring the mic to you. If you're attending remotely, please use the bubble feature in the lower right corner of your browser, and that will send your questions in, and then we will read them here. We assume that a lot of you will have questions that you want to raise, so we do ask that you keep them concise and on point so that we can address as many as possible. Tonight's event is brought to you by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at UF in partnership with the Bob Graham Center for Public Service and the Center for European Studies. One of the great things about working here at the Graham Center and in class is that we have the ability to put together programs on fairly short order on critical issues. And one of the reasons we can do that is because we have, across the range of disciplines, our own in-house experts here at UF who can provide the vital background, expertise, and context necessary for understanding such important issues. So again, we're really delighted to be able to do that with you this evening. We do have limited time this evening, though, obviously, and so we're not going to be able to cover absolutely every issue that you might individually want to hear about. So again, we hope that you can understand that. So if you're interested in approach to refugee issues, if you're interested in the role of women in this conflict, positions of different ethnic minorities, or the role of new media and technologies in different ways, we may get to some of those issues, but we can't guarantee that in an hour we can get to every single one of them. So again, feel free to ask questions during the Q&A about the issues that matter most to you. And again, we'll try to address as many of those as we can. With that, let me introduce our panel. To save time, I'm going to do a brief introduction. If you want fuller introductions of the participants in tonight's panel, you can either go to the class.ufl.edu/events page or the bobgrahamcenter.ufl.edu page and click on the link for this event, and all the bios are up there in full form. Dr. Amy Krappel is Associate Professor of Political Science and is the Jean Monnet Chair and Director of UF Center for European Studies, excuse me. She'll moderate tonight's events. My apologies for that, Amy. Dr. Seth Bernstein from the Department of History is Assistant Professor of Soviet and Post-Soviet History. Dr. Michael Gorham is Professor of Russian Studies in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And his research focuses on the intersection of culture, language, and media. Dr. Brian Muraski is Associate Professor in the Political Science Department, and he's a specialist in party politics in Ukraine and Russia. And then Dr. Zachary Selden is Associate Professor in the Political Science Department, and his research focuses on national security, the transatlantic relationship, and EU security. So I'll turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and I want to thank the Bob Graham Center and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for helping us to organize this event on a very timely topic. There are future events that will be planned both by the center and other units on campus, so please make sure that you stay in touch with Bob Graham, the college, and the Center for European Studies. The way that we're going to go today is to ask each of our panelists to very briefly address 3 different questions, and that is from their perspectives, and they all bring very different perspectives to the table, as you heard, to help us to understand what is currently going on in Ukraine, and to help us to understand how Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine has evolved to this point from their perspectives, and then also to give us some indication of where they think things might be going in the near future and the more distant future, understanding, of course, that no one is prescient, and so we're using our backgrounds as scholars and practitioners to understand more about what's happening in this current situation. We're going to start with Seth Bernstein, and then we will go to Michael Gorham, followed by Brian Muraski, and then Zach Selden. Once they've completed their first initial statements, I will come back and ask them a second round of questions, followed up by questions from the audience. Okay? So if you guys could keep it to a couple of minutes for each of the introductory questions, and then we'll have a second round. Okay? Seth, do you want to go ahead and start?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for being here. I want to give some historical context about what's happening in Ukraine. As you may have seen, Putin has declared that this invasion is an attempt to get rid of Nazis from Ukraine, and this may have puzzled some of you. From an American standpoint, it's difficult to decode this invasion to overthrow President Zelensky, who is a Ukrainian Jew, who's being said as a Nazi. However, this idea has great resonance in Russian society in many ways. What it comes from is the history of World War II, both in a Russian context and in a Ukrainian context. In Ukraine, during World War II, there was a nationalist movement that really did collaborate with Germans at times and participated even in genocide. Since 2014, even before then, there were some Ukrainian leaders who attempted to rehabilitate these nationalists as sort of freedom fighters who were not because they collaborated with the Nazis, but because they were patriots. And Putin has drawn upon this, has twisted it to make this absurd, frankly, historical parallel between what happened then and what is happening today. We shouldn't take that interpretation seriously, but we should take it seriously in the sense that it does resonate with many Russians. Now, in terms of where I think this is going, I'm hopeful that there will be a turn in Russian popular opinion as they see that this is not a defensive operation meant to get rid of Nazis, but really an offensive operation, an attack on Ukraine. And I also worry that as this narrative falters, we're going to see more and more domestic repression in Russia.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thanks for showing up tonight. This is really important stuff, and I know you all are super busy. Before I start, let me say on behalf of someone from Russian Studies who's been here for a good 2 or 3 decades, this is a conflict that touches very close to the heart of UF students, UF faculty, and UF alumni, be they Russian or Ukrainian or from some other Eastern European country. And I think it behooves us all to really bring a big chunk of empathy to anybody with relatives in any of the countries involved here, because very few, if any of them, have any sort of agency in what's going on there. I'm a language guy, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this, and I'm a Russianist, so I'm going to talk to you briefly about how this is being framed from the perspective of the official Russian media, just to give you a sense of the narrative, to pick up on what Dr. Bernstein was saying. Interestingly, just up until just a few days before the war broke out, the state-run media made little to no mention of any sort of brewing conflict in Ukraine, writing off Western warnings, which we were hearing for weeks before, of military buildup, of false flag operations, as hysteria was the term of art being used, ginned up by U.S. and its NATO allies in order to provoke, and that's a key term as well, provocation, Russia into military confrontation. Fast forward to about 10 days ago, and the narrative obviously changed. For a number of years, however, as Dr. Bernstein indicated, there's been a concerted framing initiative on the part of the media and official Russian leaders in describing the leadership of Ukraine as a junta. And these are words that are in common occurrence. Band of Nazis and thugs, drug addicts, pillagers, puppets of the U.S., who have brought about genocide. You may have heard that word being bandied about recently upon the Russian-speaking populations in southeastern Ukraine, the 2 breakaway republics. Once the conflict did break out, state news described it as a special military operation, even a peacekeeping mission. not a war, not an invasion. Those words were explicitly forbidden to be used in state media to describe events, what was going on. And the goal of this mission was twofold: demilitarization and denazification. So how has the Russian media culture evolved over the years to allow this sort of a narrative both to be created and to flow freely in public discourse, and to have a pretty significant influence, particularly on people who rely mainly on television for their information? Since Vladimir Putin emerged on the scene back in 2000, mainstream television in particular has grown increasingly controlled by the state, and largely echoes the voice and the views of the state. Independent radio and media still exist, but they have relatively small audiences. And even they, as of recently, today in fact, one of the main alternative radio stations, the oldest one, Echo Moskvy, has been blocked on the internet and taken off of the airwaves. The Russian language internet has served as the last, and it continues to grow, a bastion for a relatively free-flowing public political discourse, a space where people can pretty much say what they want. But even here, we've seen steady efforts over the past 7 years to contain and modulate that debate through various legislative, regulatory, and technological means. In Russia, social networks are hugely popular as they are here, but like their Western counterparts, they are growingly rife with trolling, flaming, misinformation, and fake news. So what we're left with is a public communication environment that provides little by way of critical feedback for decision makers, and an imperfect measure of real public opinion. So in the current situation, the Kremlin may well have found an ample support for a quick, bloodless, and victorious campaign in breakaway regions of the Donbass, much like they had with Crimea. But a much smaller number, it appears, has embraced what's turned out to be an imperfectly executed, all-out ground war against the entirety of Ukraine. In fact, if you're just relying on state television, you may not be entirely aware of the real contours of the war, either geographically or in terms of human casualties, because of the type of information you're getting on television. An equally troubling communications gap has appeared on the level of the higher elites. And by this I mean Putin and his most immediate advisors and his ministers. This was most recently displayed during a televised meeting of the Security Council just before the war was launched, when even Putin's own senior advisors seemed to be operating in an environment in which they felt compelled to tell Putin what he wanted to hear, rather than speak their mind. And it appears that many of them were largely in the dark about what was coming down the pike. So where things may be headed in the future in terms of the Russian media, the more this war and its negative consequences drag out, and the less likely Russian citizens will be to buy into the narrative that's being provided by the state-run media. Granted, that narrative may evolve over time as well. At the same time, it's unlikely, I think, that this will result in mass popular protests of any significant size. We've seen some emerge. And this is likely a result of really a decade of rigged elections and of a pretty harsh crackdown on public demonstration that hasn't been sanctioned by the state, which has created a combination of civic apathy and personal fear that your child might be put in jail if you let them go out to a demonstration. And so that's probably likely to keep a lot of people at home who would normally, 10 years ago in 2011, were showing out in massive, hundreds of thousands. As for the media, the current information war footing will likely provide justification for Russian authorities to further isolate the nation inside what they're calling a sovereign Russian internet, a kind of a digital cocoon, ostensibly geared toward protecting the Russian internet from outside invaders. The CIA could at any second flick the switch, but this also gives them the opportunity to better monitor and control traffic in that last bastion of relatively free and public speech.
Okay, thank you. Brian?
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending. This is a difficult time. I'm going to talk a little bit about more the Russian foreign policy perspective on this to contextualize it in kind of a larger view, so to speak. My interpretation, and I think it echoes some of the grounding of thinking about what drives Russian foreign policy, rests on the idea that Putin is essentially challenging the current world order. One that's really, that it sees the West, the United States, talking about national sovereignty of states being protected, encouraging possibility, if there's a violation of national sovereignty, it's out of a need to protect human rights, advance the cause of citizens who are being persecuted or underrepresented by their governments. That's the ideal position that Moscow sees the West as telling itself. In the view of Moscow, I think from the view of the Kremlin, they would argue that, in fact, the West, the United States, regularly violates national sovereignty, and it does so in the way of couching itself as protecting human rights, promoting democracy, and what we see in some of the actions of of Russia when it comes to Ukraine is mimicking and using some of the same techniques that it sees the West and the United States as having done. So actions from election observation and funding opposition parties, as again from the Russian view, violating traditional understanding of sovereignty, to more ominous actions like the NATO airstrikes in Serbia, and then only after the fact deciding that they should be allowed to make those airstrikes, wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, the institution of a no-fly zone over Libya that led to the downfall of Gaddafi and the execution of him by his people in the streets, which by some accounts Putin is very well aware of and very concerned with. To the backing of opposition of Sadat in Syria. So from the view of Moscow, these activities do not look like actions that advance the cause of democracy or human rights, but rather illustrate how great powers are held to a different standard, and smaller powers are victims of this discrepancy. Russia would like to return to the position of being a great power, and that status has historically entailed controlling Ukraine. We can get into what aspects that Ukraine brings to this, from being a buffer state to important transit routes, but this idea that Ukraine should be and can be independent for the Kremlin is either cynically not true, or Putin just really doesn't believe it. It either serves his purposes or he truly doesn't believe it, that there is some kind of independent nation there. Looking forward into some kind of crystal ball, I mean, my sense is a Russian scholar named Vladimir Gelman talks about the dangers of prediction in political science or social sciences generally, because there's unforeseen consequences or unforeseen events that lead to consequences that we wouldn't realize. His book was written in 2013. He was trying to anticipate the different directions that the Russian regime would go. He didn't anticipate the Maidan and the revolution of dignity, which clearly, in my view, didn't set Russia on a path, but really continued a path toward more authoritarian rule and more of a closed authoritarian regime. From that perspective, if you'd asked me what the situation in Ukraine would have looked like days ago, my answer would be very different because there's so many unforeseen developments. The unity that we see in the West, the resolve that we've seen. I mean, the one meme, I guess, on social media that within a weekend, Russia turned Germany away from pacifism and turned Sweden away from neutrality. Those are unforeseen developments in many ways. I mean, and from that perspective, it's hard to make any kinds of predictions here. Again, I've said this in the past, which unfortunately my sense experience, and again, being in Kiev during the Revolution of Dignity, is that, well, with Putin, if it can get worse, it kind of does. And I see his invasion of Ukraine as trying to finish what he didn't complete in 2014. And so the unity, the resolve, if it continues in the West and the attention continues to be paid, that helps Ukraine, but a lot will depend, I think, on the inner circle of Putin himself. As Professor Gorham pointed out, the Russian people have been, the landscape has been cleared and set the stage for a Russian control of its society as it pursues this invasion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Zach?
Sure. I think I'm going to focus on more the NATO angle, as that's what I tend to know best. And I sort of want to, in sort of how did this start, I want to clear up a conception that I've heard out there in the media and elsewhere, that somehow this is driven by NATO's relentless expansion to the east, which threatens Russia, and that it is a NATO-driven process by Western states to threaten Russia. I need to say at the outset that NATO does not go about asking countries to join it. That's not its purpose. What NATO is an organization that when states approach it, right, it is their sovereign decision to decide if they want to make an association with that organization and what kind of association they want to have, up to and including membership, right? No other state, not Russia, not the United States, has a veto over that, right? This is about independent states making their foreign policy decisions. It's also not the case that the prospect of NATO membership drove Russia to invade now. Ukrainian membership in NATO is not on the table, and it is not on the table for a very clear reason, which Russia understands implicitly, and created, in fact, right? If you have territorial conflicts on your territory, NATO will not bring you in as a member for obvious reasons. It's not going to extend Article 5 guarantees with a state that has an existing conflict on its territory. So that simply can't happen. As long as those Russia-generated conflicts exist in Ukraine, Ukraine will never get a membership action plan, and Russia knows it. So if that was Russia's strategic goal, it had achieved that already before this invasion with the status quo ante. So that explanation doesn't fit. If you want to try to understand why this happened, you have to turn to other things. So I want to clear that up. To continue with the sort of the NATO theme, how we got here, which is sort of the next point of questioning, I think an interesting feature of this conflict is how well Ukrainian forces have done in this conflict compared to Russia. And that's attributable to many factors. But one thing I think we have to think about is the level of engagement that Ukraine had with NATO since 2014, since the initial Russian invasion and takeover of Donbass and Crimea and Luhansk. After that, Ukraine and NATO worked out a cooperative agreement. It was a what's called a comprehensive action plan. And it specifies a number of technical areas of cooperation and development, which they have worked very intensely on for the last 6-7 years. And they are things like command, control, communications, computers, logistics, cybersecurity. All that stuff sounds incredibly mundane and technical, but this is the stuff that gets you to win wars, right? And what you've seen with Russia is that Russia over the last 15 years has developed a military with a very good tip of the spear, right? But it lacks the supply, it lacks the communications, it lacks the tactical training, it lacks the logistical coordination, and that is why you're seeing Russian units stranded without fuel or without food, right? So all these things that actually make you an effective fighting force, Ukraine's been working on very diligently with NATO over these years, and I think that's paying off in certain ways. It's important to note that in a conflict like this, as it drags on, this is increasingly a losing game for Russia and its political aims, right? All of its long-term foreign policy goals are being seriously damaged by this, right? Russia does not want to see large NATO installations on its borders in the Baltic states. And we have not done that. We, NATO, collectively, have not done that out of sensitivity to Russian security concerns. I can tell you now that that is out the window, right? Sweden and Finland, as neutral states, somebody had mentioned this, considering NATO membership, something that Russia definitely does not want, right? And for years, of course, a core interest of Russian foreign policy was trying to create divisions within Europe, within the European Union, and also in the transatlantic alliance. I have to say, I've been working in this relationship for, basically 20 years, right? I've never seen a point of this much agreement and consensus as I do now, except for perhaps, the immediate days after 9/11, across the transatlantic space and within Europe. So Russia, regardless of what happens militarily in Ukraine, they have lost in the larger strategic picture already. And so I think that would cover some of the major things about the future. So I think I will stop there and turn it back to you for questions.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask two questions, and you guys can choose to answer one or both, but if you choose to answer both, I'll ask you to do it very briefly. So if you decide to answer just one of them, I will understand. So two questions for you to think about. How effective is the rhetoric in Russia and other Russia-friendly areas? That is, we talked about the denazification rhetoric, the idea of saving ethnic Russians, the idea of trying to throw the bums out, right? So to what extent has this vilification worked, and what is the potential for this strategy to expand? And here I'm thinking about possible false flag events, particularly where you have other large clusters of ethnic Russians that may or may not be suffering any kind of injustice, but in the countries that border Russia, you have opportunities for future conflicts. So the first question is this rhetoric and the use of rhetoric, which can be then turned to false flag events. What do we expect from that? And my second question, and this is a doozy, so I apologize in advance. To what extent is there a straightforward solution? How do we get out of where we are? We've focused a lot on where we are and how we got here. But given the very real differences in worldviews between Russia and the West, notions of sovereignty, notions of right, and given the very real harm that is being caused both to Ukraine and to Russia economically, how do we get out of this situation? How do we find the path forward? And in particular, what does the West do to make that the shortest possible path? Apologies, that was tough. And we'll go in backwards order. So, Zach, sorry.
Wow. Give me the tough question and go in backwards order. I'll just take on that last doozy of a question. So are you talking in terms of what do we do to perhaps resolve the situation, or sort of moving forward in a more general sense?
I think everyone agrees that the shortest road to an end is the best at this point, to end this as quickly as possible. So how do we do that, given all of these challenges that you've all outlined in very different ways?
All right. My preferred path, and this perhaps speaks to my background as in diplomacy in this area, is that you don't push back against the place where a person is strongest, right? You find many other ways to push around them and create conditions by which you frame the game in a different way, and you're not playing their game anymore, but they're playing your game, right? So how do you do that? Well, yes, you can push back in Ukraine directly in some ways, and we are, right? With the provision of aid, military aid, in a very concerted way, that is distinctly helpful. The political unity, all that's great. But there should be a lot of other things going on at the same time. So, for example, you mentioned the tool that Russia has used, the excuse of ethnic Russian minorities in certain places as a rationale for intervention. Okay, there was a dry run for all this. That was not a dry run. The first run of this was 2008 in the Republic of Georgia in South Ossetia. Puts Georgia in the same position where there's a territorial conflict on its ground that prevents it from becoming closer with the European Union or with NATO. Well, Russia's a little distracted. Maybe we should be having those discussions with Georgia about maybe this is the time for you to act to resolve that conflict. Maybe we should be pouring that equipment and military training in there that might help them make them do that. Even if it's not going to happen, the very fact that it is a possibility is going to force Russia to divide its forces to protect against that. That's going to take pressure off for Ukraine. Right? So you think about things like that can flank your opponent and change the nature of the game, right? Obviously, you don't want to take things too close to the area where you start to get into armed conflict. But there are ways to use the existing tensions in the region, which frankly Russia has generated, right, to create problems which they will have to wrestle with. So that is how I would probably look at going forward.
Okay, Brian?
Okay, two tough questions. I mean, I guess I would challenge the notion that a quicker resolution to the conflict is better, because quicker could be better for one side and worse for the other,
Fair
for
enough.
sure. I would say most of my life, I try not to be on Twitter and social media. I have found it useful in the last few days, including Michael McFaul, former ambassador and political science professor at Stanford's point, or suggestion perhaps, of trying to make it clear to Putin's inner circle that those who split with him will quickly have sanctions removed on them and will have opportunities to, again, engage in business in the West. At this point, my read of the Putin regime continues to be a question of we need some degree of elite defection, some kind of split. When we think about autocratic regimes, that is a critical moment if you can get elite defection and bringing them down. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll get a better regime in its place, but it could, if it's the defection occurs because of the war in Ukraine, we hopefully would have an end to the war in Ukraine. On the other side of it, the kind of false flag events, I mean, I really see this as an indication of free media and access to the internet. Thank you, to Elon Musk for providing Starlink. And that sounds a little silly, but the Bellingcat investigation organization, some of you may know or may not know, is very much active in trying to identify false flag operations. It takes a couple days, but they are reporting on the claim that there was a car bombing in Donetsk, I believe, and I think DNR, the Donetsk People's Republic, and have reported that that was staged, that they have evidence that there was a cadaver in the car, and it was, again, a false flag operation. That kind of information needs to get out there. The question is who's getting the information. I mean, I think a lot of the world today with free internet access sees where we are with Russia. We understand that we're hearing one thing and they're doing another. So that gives us hope outside of Ukraine. I want to go back a little bit just quickly to Zach's point about logistics, because I'm wondering just how much the Russian military was buying into their own narrative. Because I've seen no discussion on social media that you had a couple of Russian troops run out of gas and go into a Ukrainian police station looking for gas. And I think the message there, it sounds ridiculous and they're calling them idiots, but I think it gives you the sense that these are troops, they're young men who are told that they are liberating Ukraine from neo-Nazis, that they would be welcomed with open arms, that they would be supported by the domestic population. They're not idiots, they're coming with that frame of reference, and shows you the power of the Russian propaganda machine and the degree they've been indoctrinated with this kind of thinking. And I also wonder how much that tells us about how much Putin maybe is really kind of believing this idea and has bought into his own rhetoric about what Ukraine is and how Ukrainians feel. So I'll stop there.
Michael?
Yeah, I'll definitely avoid question number 2, other than to agree with Dr. Moraski that leaving, to the extent that the U.S. has the ability or the West has the ability, leaving the internet open and trying to maintain it is vital. I think largely the shift in sentiment in the West over the past 5 days has basically been driven by social media and these incredible clips that we've been seeing, not just about the terror of war, but the bravery of common everyday Ukrainian citizens who are, just arming themselves, sending their loved ones across the border and staying back to fight for their homeland. It's had a huge impact, and the more of that stuff that gets out, I think the more likely it is for this momentum to keep up. There's a reverse side to that, though, and that is that it's a slippery slope, because now Western-run social media platforms are starting to shut down certain Russian official sites. Some of you may have heard of the government-funded site RT, which used to be called Russia Today, and that's been shut down across major swaths of Europe now by Facebook, the Facebook page of this site. And that sort of activity, I mean, it's true that there's a lot of misinformation that RT puts out, but that sort of activity is just a golden invitation for the Russian supervisory agencies that oversee the Russian internet to go off and, shut down those last vestiges of open and relatively neutral information. Not to mention Western sources as well. So we have to be a little bit careful about our own penchant to clamp down. And I think sanctions, you could talk about sanctions as well. Maybe we'll get to that in the question and answer period.
Okay, Seth.
Thanks. I won't add much to the kind of formal end game of what's going to happen with the war. Just to say that I don't think it's going to be a short war, no matter what. Not in the sense that the conflict will extend, in terms of the fighting, but that there will be a refugee problem for years. That there will be embedded in people's memory for years, this conflict. This is how, historical memory forms through these kinds of conflicts. It's important to remember that Ukraine itself was a riven society before this war, that it was actually more united in the past few years because of Russian intervention, and more solidified on both sides. In the East, more solidified around a pro-Russian narrative, and in the western parts of Ukraine around an anti-Russian narrative or a pro-Ukrainian narrative. And we're seeing that those narratives militarized, and they will be for years, I think. And there are there's more than 500,000 refugees at this point, something like 600,000. What's going to happen to those people, right? And what those people think about what happened to them. It's going to be a long war.
Okay, thank you. So I believe there are microphones in the audience, and I believe we have some opportunities for folks on the live stream to submit questions. So now is your opportunity. If you would want to raise your hand and ask a question. I will ask that you very briefly ask your question. If there's a particular individual you want to direct it to, please do so. And if you can just let us know if you're a student or a member of the community.
Hello, I'm a student, and I was just wondering if you can speak upon the Azov Battalion and their fascist kind of leanings. What does that mean in terms of the grand scheme of things?
Okay. Is there someone who wants to take that on?
I can talk about it. I guess my an analogy would be that I was visiting. It would get old if I keep saying it, but I was in Ukraine from January 2014 through May 2014. And I visited the Maidan regularly. And on occasion, you could see graffiti that was clearly of neo-Nazi nature. I also saw women, various ages, bringing tea and food to the riot police on the other side. I saw pensioners, women, banging on sheeting pulled off of construction sites from 11:30 a.m. until 8:30 p.m. at night. I call it the rhythm of the Maidan. It's just what you heard. You can pick any group and find bad apples and good apples. There's another kind of meme that I have, kind of political cartoon that was shown where was the idea of a kind of a Russian security guard looking for neo-Nazis, and there's this little small guy who's got Azov on his hat, and there's these large images of other Ukrainians that represent other parts of society, right? So, yes, I mean, if you want to find villains, you can do that. To point to the Zelensky regime and call it a junta full of neo-Nazis, it's misleading. I mean, if you look at the way I don't want to go on about it too much, but if you look at the 2014 presidential election, all right, the hacking of that by Russia was to make it as though the second place candidate was actually someone who won about 1% of the vote. He was a far-right candidate, but he had 1% of the vote. But Russia's goal was to hack the electoral system and have the results show that he had won second place, so he would be going on to the runoff. It just, again, it's the degree to which we're not in a post-truth world. There are facts and there are lies, and there are lies.
Thank you. Okay. Can we ask another question?
Yes, I have a question from our online audience. We all know about the deep sense of shame in Germany for the barbaric crimes that were committed by the Nazis. Is there a new Russian and Belarusian stigma for years to come? And nobody was specified, so whoever wants to jump in.
Michael?
I'd be happy to address that. There's very much an ongoing conversation on the old media and the new media about the degree to which there is such a thing as collective responsibility and shame and guilt, and so it's very much an active conversation going on, and it's not just limited to people living inside of Russia, but it's folks who have rarely been to Russia or who left Russia long ago. And again, that's to get back to my very first point. That's a big reason why we need to be cognizant of our own tendency, at least if we're from American culture, to kind of put labels on Russia as an ethnic group. There's a long, rich tradition rooted largely in Hollywood of Russia being the best kind of bad guy. And that sort of discourse tends to get accentuated in ways that really target folks who are totally innocent and who may actually be, our own fellow travelers, folks who feel like we do and share our same values or potentially do. So by kind of stoking this anti-Russian sentiment, without being very particular about the actors that we're referring to, we are playing directly into Putin's playbook. One of his favorite words is Russophobia. And what we do not want to do is be Russophobes accidentally, because that's just sort of playing into that whole game.
Okay, can we get a question from the audience? How about right over here? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Hi, my name is Andy. I'm a student. This question is in relation to the point you made earlier about Putin's use of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine to justify his invasion into Ukraine, his idea that there's a genocide in there that we're protecting these people from. And I remember when I first heard of the situation, the first thing I thought about was, well, what about Transnistria? What about South Ossetia, as mentioned earlier? What about, I'm not sure if it applies the same way, but Abkhazia perhaps as well. My question is what do European allies in this sense do to accommodate these regions, and what are these people in these regions thinking right now as they see Ukraine being invaded?
Zach or Brian, probably?
Well, I guess it can't speak definitively what they're thinking, I guess. There is a sense that, of course, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Russia was giving out passports for years before it actually moved to then subsequently recognize these breakaway regions, and they were breakaway regions prior to the war in Georgia in 2008, for example. So again, when I think about the consequences, the knock-on consequences, I do think this is an important question, because if you're following it, some of the discussion by some talking heads in cable news, et cetera, they tend to say, well, there's a red line at NATO, we'll stop at NATO, and there's no concerns, and they're interviewing people like the president of Estonia from a couple of years back, and he's confident because he's part of NATO, but there's other European countries, Moldova and Georgia, that are not part of NATO. And so the question also, it's a good question, I think so, but it matters more from the, not necessarily those two regions that have already been recognized by Russia as independent, but whether or not that leads to some kind of greater intervention in Georgia more broadly. It leads to a full-scale takeover of Moldova, because Moldova chooses to go more westward and more toward the European Union, or it's going that direction. But again, that's kind of my initial thinking on it.
Zach, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, just to sort of flesh that out a little bit, yes, in a place like Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, where there are ethnic Russian minorities, the sense is that, well, we're NATO members, we're protected from this sort of thing. But, think about how these things tend to start. It tends to usually start with some sort of civil disturbance or riot, oftentimes generated by people coming across from Russia who are frankly Russian agents or working with Russian intelligence services. Then usually there's the volunteers who come in to supplement that. And then you have this potentially a breakaway little bit of Estonia or something like that near, say, Narva, going up towards St. Petersburg. And then what do, right? Is NATO going to get into a war with Russia over some obscure province of Estonia, right? So, but if it doesn't, what's the credibility of the alliance? And one can see Russia thinking, well, that could be a way to really upend the transatlantic security alliance, weaken American security guarantees in Europe. So I don't think we're done seeing this played, and I don't think that states which border on NATO, which have ethnic Russian minorities, are immune because of that Article 5 guarantee.
Okay, do we have another question from the online streaming?
Yes, so from the online audience, we have several questions that are related to the efficacy of sanctions. So if you could all address this according to your area of expertise.
Zach, you wrote a book.
Yes, I did. Sure, sanctions. Sanctions, what about it? I mean, what do you...
Efficacy.
Efficacy of
Sanctions
sanctions.
will work.
Okay, what you've seen actually is an interesting thing about the sanctions that have been imposed is that they've been far more comprehensive than anyone ever expected when we started out, right? There has been a snowball of unity amongst countries that were initially very reluctant about this. And so now what you're looking at is, swift sanctions being applied towards certain banks that could expand out to others. You see the Russian central bank's assets, which are held abroad, being frozen, which has a huge impact on their ability to sustain the value of the ruble. Those have very strong immediate effects. Here's what I think might be a long-term consequence of what's going on. And it's not exactly sanctions, but it is sort of an economic factor that I think needs to be brought up. It is often pointed out that Europe is heavily dependent on Russian gas and that gives Russia leverage. True, right? But what is often left out of that discussion is that Russia is very heavily dependent on those gas exports for export earnings, right? So I believe, I'm just looking at my notes here, yeah, so gas sales to Europe compose about 70% of all of Russia's gas exports. It's a huge chunk of their export earnings. As Dmitry Trenin called Rosneft, the gas marketing company, is a piggy bank for the Kremlin. Well, you're hitting the Kremlin pretty hard with that, right? And you're hitting some of the prime oligarchs with that. And there is a distinct chance here. One of the things that's different from now, as opposed to 2014, in 2014, the United States was not an exporter of liquefied natural gas. Today, it's exporting somewhere in the range of 14 billion cubic feet per day, right? And that capacity can grow even more, and relatively rapidly. And as that does, right, that increases global supply, more of that can go towards Europe. And Europe, and this is a great place for EU-US transatlantic cooperation, Europe has built a lot of liquefied natural gas facilities in Western Europe and the ability to move gas from west to east. What this says is that Russia may be looking at a time in which it loses market share for its prime export permanently. And this is through fixed infrastructure, right, through pipelines that it can't change. So it would have to build entirely new pipelines down to China to try to market that same product. That's costly, that's time-consuming. This could be a devastating kind of sanction on Russia, and it could hit the people who are most responsible for this at the very top. So
Michael?
I'll leave that there.
Yeah, I share those last two sentiments. I wonder how viable sanctions on natural gas really are. Not a specialist in that area, so from what I hear, it's not likely to happen, but maybe things will get bad enough for that to happen. But hitting the Russian central bank and its reserves was huge. Nobody really saw that coming. Nobody really anticipated. It wasn't even discussed really in the build-up to the war when people were wondering what was going to be hit. Everyone was talking about the SWIFT banking system, that's sort of this electronic online system cutting Russian banks off from access to that. And they've done that partially, but in blocking access to the central bank's reserves, you're basically taking that bulwark of safety net that Putin has been building up for the past 8 or 9 years in anticipation of greater sanctions, because it was enough money to basically pay your debts and make sure that the ruble doesn't crash precipitously. But that's now very much a problem, I think, and we see that in the price of the ruble dropping recently. Where I have problems with sanctions, it's has to do, and sanctioning oligarchs and people in Putin's inner circle and their family members who are more often being relied on to, officially be the person on the contract when it comes to the villa in Italy or France. That's fair game too. But we're hearing a lot of talk about sanctioning student visas, the whole visa system, and cultural figures, such and such an artist isn't going to be allowed to perform, or individual athletes. I can understand, national teams perhaps, but individual athletes. When you get to that level, it seems to me you're kind of running at cross purposes. It seems to me we want more of Russia's most talented coming out of Russia, either to realize their dreams in the West and recognize that that's possible. I mean, where did Einstein come from, after all? Then trying to close that curtain down. And closing that curtain down also, again, plays into the Kremlin playbook, gives them the opportunity to turn to their population and say, see, they're punishing you. You're part of this. And that's music to Putin's ears, because his entire population is now implicated in this war, when in fact they had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay, I'm going to try to get one more in-person and one more online question. You've been very patient. Go ahead. Can you wait for the mic?
Oh, yes, thank you. Jonathan Chiarella, political science in the PhD program. So I had a question that was, I guess, on the tactics. So this may be for Drs. Sullivan and Bernstein, because the history of it may overlap with maybe what has happened in the Balkans before. considering how Zelensky has been distributing weapons to civilians, and it's just been like, if you want to stay and fight, and he's had this policy of not letting men between 18 and 60 leave. It's understandable, lots of countries have drafts, what have you. But given the fact that you have this combined with the distribution of weapons to civilians, how might this policy affect or change how Russia is going to conduct its urban warfare? How are Russia's tactics going to change? Like, might it say, well, look, civilians have guns, they're fair game, you want to go loot and pillage, go for it, and blow up everybody in the house because they might have guns, so do it. Or is it not going to have an effect either way?
Okay. Guys? Zach and or Seth?
Yeah, I mean, there's an entire possibility that, we were talking about this earlier today, that this turns into another Grozny, right? One hopes that doesn't occur. But when you get involved in urban combat, every window opening, every doorway, every sewer grate is a potential vector for attack. So regardless of what's going on. So yeah, it becomes a very bloody, messy, street-to-street sort of struggle. And one hopes that it doesn't descend into that. But, if it does, once again, the long-term implications for Russia and where it stands in the international community, I think, will be so damaged, it's going to take, I don't know how long to recover from. So that would be my basic sense.
Okay, Seth and then Brian.
Yeah, I'll say that we've already seen some slippage between civilian and military targets, where Russia in the first days was saying, we're only attacking military targets, bases, aerodromes, right? Airfields. And now we're seeing them go after more civilian targets, right? Things that clearly cannot be attacked without civilian casualties. Are they going to pivot to saying that there were fighters there, right? There were insurgents there? Probably yes. Then from the other side of things, you mentioned Grozny, that's a militarized society in Chechnya, right? That's a society that went through a lot of war, and Russia is still facing the consequences. I had a Russian friend, say, I can't believe that if you told me 20 years ago that we would be sending Chechens to fight Ukrainians, right? Chechnya, which Russia fought a big war against, to fight Ukraine where it was an allied state, I wouldn't have believed it, right? So I think, Ukraine is going to be a militarized society no matter what for a while.
Brian?
That's a nice segue to what I was thinking, which is that it's worth noting that Putin doesn't control Chechnya. Ramzan Kadyrov runs Chechnya, right? And it's not clear how much control Putin has over Ramzan Kadyrov. He's a loyal surrogate, and he's also allowed, it seems as though, free reign. We see a very brutal warlord in Chechnya, and that deal with the devil, I guess two devils making a deal, was made because of, I guess, you can bomb as much as you'd like, but people will get out of the urban centers and make their way. And that type of warfare is just going to solidify the enemy's resolve. And, the control over Chechnya required, again, a local ruler to come and use death squads and be able to use the locals to find the locals. What a horrible scenario to think about emerging in Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe besides Russia.
Okay, if we can get one last question from our streaming audience.
Yes, so from the online audience, we have questions coming in on two broader matters. So I'm just going to present both to you all, and you can choose which one you want to address. So the first one is, what is China's role moving forward in all of this? Very broad, but again, you can address it from your own perspective. And secondly, how concerned should we be of Putin's raising the nuclear alert level?
Okay, well, you two have had practice with these questions because we had them this afternoon. But I think since this is the last round of questions, we can just have everyone take a crack
Could
at
you
this.
repeat the first one
or any
about China?
last comments. The nuclear threat. How concerned should we be
I
about
got the nuclear threat. The first question was about
China.
China.
China's role in all of this moving forward.
Yeah.
I guess my reaction this afternoon was that China's role, initially, I think a lot of people's eyebrows raised thinking that Putin was meeting with Xi Jinping. And I think, China is sitting back and saying, let's see how you do, right? Which is China definitely has an interest in making the West look bad and kind of bringing down this Washington-led world order, so to speak, but is not, fully behind Putin on this. I think there's a sense of we'll see where it goes before China is willing to back Russia in that way. The nuclear option. I don't know if anyone else wants to take that. It's the ultimate call, I guess, so to speak, right? I mean, I almost want to echo the representative of Ukraine at the UN. I don't know if everyone saw that today, which was if Putin would like to kill himself, he recommends him pursuing the option of the person in Berlin in 1945. There's no sense in taking out the rest of the world. I don't know how serious the nuclear weapons are. The idea of using a nuclear deterrent for financial sanctions because your people are starving or your oligarchs can't go to Rome and spend their millions is that does seem like as though we move beyond kind of rational thinking to madman type of behavior. I think that Putin definitely wants to be perceived as a madman or unpredictable. I don't think he's that unpredictable.
Anyone else?
And yet nobody saw a total invasion, ground invasion of Ukraine coming 10 days ago. Very few people, aside from our esteemed chair, saw that coming. No, I think it needs to be obviously taken very seriously. The discourse on using nuclear arsenal or the invocation of its existence has come up frighteningly a lot in the last week or so. One of the main weekend political shows, one of the highest rated political shows on Russian television, features a guy named Dmitry Kiselyov. And he was the first one who 7-8 years ago said that Russia's the only country that can turn the United States into nuclear dust. Well, he's back at it again and devoted a good portion of his Sunday show to that very theme. Putin has invoked it a couple of times. The freezing of the bank assets is essentially, not to overwork a metaphor, the nuclear option in sanctions, and so we're a lot closer. I'm not saying that we're close, but we're a lot closer to strategic nuclear arms or something like that than we were a month ago. And I don't think Putin is all that predictable. And as far as China goes, I think for that very reason they are quite cautious in dealing with Russia. They are much more liable to look in the long term, decades and centuries, rather than the short term. And the idea that you have this hot-headed guy who likes to be the madman, it doesn't quite fit their playbook, it seems to me.
Seth or Zach?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about nuclear strategy and how it's developed over the ages, one of the things that failed for the United States in nuclear strategy early on was relying on them and then finding out that there's an awful lot of things that your adversaries can do that the threat of nuclear weapons use simply isn't credible, right? Because it's so over the top of whatever's going on that no one's going to believe you would actually do it. It's hard for me to perceive under the current conditions what could possibly lead to an immediate jump to nuclear escalation when we generally perceive of these things as going through, conventional options, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and then finally turning to strategic nuclear options. That is how both Russia has conceived nuclear strategy and the United States for decades. So I would find it very odd that this is somehow being thrown out there as a credible threat, to my mind. In terms of China, yeah, I think that I agree entirely with Dr. Moraski that, they're playing a watchful waiting game. But I think another thing that's very important that's come out of this is Russia has revealed that its military is, in fact, rather weak, right? And when you're talking about some sort of grand strategic partnership between, the authoritarian axis between the PRC and Russia, it means that the PRC is looking at Russia as even more of a junior partner than perhaps they did previously. And, how much of a partner will it be? Those things are all valuable questions. At this point, China may start to look at Russia as a convenient gas station and not much else. So I don't see necessarily an emerging grand strategic partnership between the PRC and Russia based on what's going on right now.
Seth?
Yeah, I don't have anything to say about China, but I will talk a little bit about the nuclear threat in the context of what we thought was credible and incredible. And, like Professor Gorham said, we thought a few days ago, many of us, that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine was incredible, right, unbelievable. And yet here we are. And what is shown is that Putin is willing to play with paradigms, right, to change what we thought were the rules internationally, and I fear to say, as someone with a lot of contacts in Russia domestically. So I don't know what's to come, but I know that things are in flux now, and a lot of options are on the table that we didn't think were before.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to let that happy note go. I've been very good. I would say that while I don't necessarily think of Putin as a picture for rationality or even sanity, I also think that survival is a pretty critical core desire. And I said only a little bit jokingly, I actually did expect an invasion. Had a long conversation with a friend of mine from the region because of the rhetoric, because of the nationalist rhetoric, and because it wasn't about rationality in my rat choicey kind of a way. It's not a rational decision to do. There is nothing to be gained. As Zach said, they had a situation in which Ukraine could not enter NATO, right? They had a West that was largely divided. They had a Germany that didn't want to invest in defense. They had an Italy and a Germany that were increasingly economically tied to Russia and dividing the EU. They had a lot of things that were going their way. And while even as an EU expert, I wouldn't have predicted this level of unity, although the EU surprised us on Brexit, so it's good to see that they can do it when they need to. This has not been rational in the sense of that kind of utility dynamic. But it has been rational from the sense of the deeper emotive feeling about Ukraine and Russia and the borders of Russia as Rus, right? That makes sense. So I think a frustrated Putin who is incredibly angry at the response from Ukraine and then the response of the West to Ukraine, the extraordinary ability of Zelensky to rally both the West and his own people, which is unexpected given his history and his past and his experience, I think that has frustrated Putin. And I think that Putin is playing the only card that he has left. I think that is very far from pushing the button. And I know that there are a lot of people in Europe and in Russia's near abroad who are very concerned right now. And I think we have to understand that pushing that button has, of course, devastating effects for that wherever that first bomb lands. But the knock-on effects for Russia is game over.
I mean, I don't want to also be a Me Tooer, but there is a sense that, when people are asking me about the prospects for war in Ukraine, my sense was, again, not necessarily the traditional rational choice perspective, but just how intensely Russia felt about Ukraine. And how could you read this a week ago, 2 weeks ago? What was Russia's offer? And if you think, you're negotiating with someone and they're going to you're selling a car, right? And you're going to ask for more than you'll actually sell it for. But the ask was so great. It gave a very clear signal of how much Russia valued Ukraine. Going back, rolling NATO back to 1997 levels, right? Prior to the expansion of the Visegrad 4. Right? I mean, and a guarantee, let alone the guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. I mean, this was such a large ask that even if it was only 70% of that, it is a tremendous level of intensity. And with that kind of ask, I couldn't imagine that there was any room for negotiation. Was it going to be a full-scale invasion? This is where the tactical aspect of Putin comes in. How much can he get? What is the scenario? What are the reactions? And then how much further to move? Whether that was all planned or not, or responding to the situation on the ground, I don't. But I wasn't surprised that we saw the troops roll across the border.
All right, well, sorry. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to all of those who had questions that we couldn't answer, both here in person and online. I think there will be ongoing events. As I mentioned, the Center for European Studies will have an event on the 16th. Please reach out if you'd like additional information. We'll share that with Bob Graham and the college as well. There are innumerable other opportunities to learn more, and I know that the college is trying to collect some of that information and make a resource site available for folks. So thank you very much for everyone.